Wow, I can't believe I'm finally done making every single Eeveelution in one giant Pokemon Perler. As is tradition, let's throw some tape. I'm just kidding. I couldn't do it. I was way too nervous. I definitely took my time getting this one prepped because I didn't want to ruin it in the last minute, and you can absolutely ruin a whole Perler just by putting the tape down wrong. If the tape accidentally slips out of your hand or you pull it just before you lay it down, whole rows of beads can be completely knocked over. On the side there, you can see me putting the tape down on the table first and then pulling it out to be the whole length of the perler. With big projects like this, I don't typically try to get all of the little pieces that overhang either. At least not with the large pieces of tape. If you look, you can see Sylveon's foot. I end up going back over and putting little pieces to cover that. The first thing that I do is I cover the largest pieces with tape. Then I usually end up cutting off the excess tape and use those small bits to cover up parts like the foot there. You'll also see me cover up little pieces like the top of Sylveon's ribbons or Espeon's tail on the far side. And every once in a while when you're laying down the tape, you mess up some beads with your sleeves. But it's cold in my office, so I'll just have to deal. Thankfully, it's just a couple of beads. It's nothing crazy. I also want to add in, if you're making large perlers like this, buy the widest tape you can find, because it's way less stressful to drop down 3 pieces or 4 pieces of a 3-inch tape instead of having to do 10 or more of a smaller width. After switching to this large painter's tape, I'm not going to get anything different. Just food for thought. Also, don't forget, once you have all your tape down, cut off all of the excess and make sure that none of the tape is stuck to the board before you flip it. It'll make things so much easier. Just make sure that you go around the entire perler and you get every bead on some tape. You don't want any beads partially covered. You want the whole bead covered, because otherwise those beads are going to fall, and that's going to be a big pain later. Here's what the Eeveelution Pokemon Perler Bead design looks like, covered in tape with all of the edges cut out. This will make poking the holes and then pulling it off so much easier. You'll see. We're just moving along now. Then I grab my handy tool with a hard edge that's comically heavy to make sure that the beads are really stuck to that tape. I'm sure this is going to do a great job for pushing the beads down. Some people say it's impossible to lift, but I did. This is the part that triggers my fan base the most, I think, because I get dozens of comments of people saying to use the pegboards. But look, there's problems that come with pegboards too. Much worse than using a pen to poke the holes. Yeah, the pen is slower, however, you don't mess it up. You never have to redo beads when you're using a pen. Or a custom little poker that you make, or maybe one of those pizza wheel things that poke the holes in the dough. I think those work. However, for now, I'm going to use the pen to poke thousands of tiny holes. So now it's time for the flip. This is by far the scariest part when you make perlers like this using the tape method. When you make smaller perler designs, they don't tend to fold in on themselves, and typically it's easier for you to flip them in one single go. Although this perler was my entire arm length. I was super nervous doing this, and you can see me as I'm pulling up the tape here. I'm very gently lifting it off the edges. Besides me being nervous, this is a really good habit to be in if you use the tape method for perlers. Also, when you make a perler that is this big, you have to be careful of the middle bending, because you can't quite pull it tight as you're lifting it usually. There has to be some slack in the middle. And depending on how you put your tape in, you could pull your perler apart in midair, and that would be a disaster. So it's always good to be mindful of which direction your tape is laying. This is a point of no return. Once you start lifting your perlers off like this, you have to just go for it. And thankfully the perler gods were nice, and this flipped over incredibly well. Only a handful of beads came off. However, Leafeon and Espeon folded in on each other, but I did get lucky that the tape didn't get stuck to itself. After laying this one down, I had to take a step away and just breathe a little. So I went and got a refill on some of my tea. One thing I will say though is that the flip is not as bad as screwing up a melt. The beads can be put back in place, no problem. It just takes time and is very disappointing. But if you screw up a melt, you just throw it away. It is absolutely brutal. However, this is kind of my favorite part. I know a lot of people can get nervous melting their perlers together, which is why they tend to lightly melt each side. However, I kind of go hard when I make perlers. I want to make them as best as I possibly can, which means fully melting this side you see right here in one go. What I see most people do as they melt perlers is they lay heavy stuff on one side and then work to the other side. That way, as they progress, they keep stacking more and more books across their perler to keep it flat as it cools. I do things a little bit differently. I like to try to keep the whole perler hot and melt the whole thing at the same time. But before that, I noticed that a couple beads got knocked over when I flipped over the parchment paper. So I'm going to fix those right here. You definitely want to make sure none of your beads are laying down sideways like this, because they'll melt completely flat like that. And it's kind of disappointing when you find a couple of those. But with my heat press on, it is time to melt. So to go a little deeper into how I do this, I generally will start working my way across the perler from one side to the other, but I'll keep doing that. I don't just start on one side and melt it and then move on. How I like to do it is I get the beads hot and they start to melt, and then I slowly work my way across. I go back and forth and back and forth. That way, hopefully, all of the beads will start melting at the same point, and no one spot will actually start cooling. Cooling is what you want to avoid because that's when it starts to curl, where a lot of people end up having disappointing melts. Usually when I start melting a perler, I work my way around the edges, like you see me doing here, and I don't generally hit the middles that often because as you work around the edges, especially ones shaped like this, you're going to hit the middle anyways, and you don't want to over melt the middle. So there's definitely a balance between melting too much and not melting enough. Now you understand why it can be tricky. In this shot here, you can actually see what I'm talking about, how the middle is almost fully melted and the edges on the bottom there on the top, you can still see there's beads that are not closed yet. So to get those edge beads closed, you have to take your iron and gently go over the edges. If you push too hard while you're trying to get the beads closed, you'll end up melting a line in your perler where the edge of your iron is. As you can see here though, I have almost all of the edges completely melted. There's little spots here and there where you can see through the parchment paper, and you'll notice that some of the beads aren't actually closed. But I just gave the edges a once over and it's good to go. I'd say that I probably got almost every single bead completely closed on this one, which is always super cool to see. I finally got to the step where I can remove the parchment paper here. I've always really enjoyed watching this part because it's the first time that I actually get to see the perler when it's melted. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching my video. It's so much longer than what I normally make, and I appreciate all of you here. I'm getting really close to finishing this perler, only a couple steps left, and then I can mount it. Lots of people worry about mounting, but with the way I do perlers, it's never a problem. This is the boring step. You just stack a lot of heavy stuff on top of it. Just the parts you see in this video took me about 2 days. Part of that was some wait time because I needed it to cool and to make sure it was completely flat. And I know that I have a big subsection of my followers that love these tape pulls, so this is for all of you that are watching. This clip is sped up quite a bit. It took me like 6 or 7 minutes to pull all this tape off. It was a little bit annoying because it started coming off in little strips, whereas usually you can pull the whole thing off in one go and it's super fast and easy. Overall, this was such a cool perler to make and I'm so happy I got to share it with everybody. Unfortunately for me, my too much gene is kicking in and I kind of feel like I want to make something bigger now. My table is 6 feet by 4 feet, so I do have the space for something massive. But that's crazy talk right now. Thank you guys for watching and seeing this amazing perler come to an end. So subscribe to my account for more Pokemon Perler Bead content. I put out daily videos and turn your guys' comments into these awesome perlers. Okay, bye!